I am part of the group of deaconesses that became called into being a deaconess right after that the movement was established again. So in 1996, up until that point, deaconesses, the whole process was put on hold. And it was at an assembly that I met Betty Perkey. And at that time, I was a public school teacher, and I told her that I was feeling called to ministry, but I knew I didn't want to be a pastor or be involved with anything other than what I was doing. And she says, "Oh, you'll make a perfect deaconess. You need to be with us." So that's sort of how I kind of fell into being a deaconess, because the diaconal programs in the United Methodist Church were no longer available. I didn't want to become clergy, and yet I knew God had a call on my life and how I was going to live that out. So I just feel fortunate that all came together at the right time for me to be able to start my studies and get my commissioning. And we were just commissioning then, which happened in 2001 in November. And it's interesting because it was right after the 9/11 in New York City with the trade towers. And so, it was interesting coming into the city and going through that in an era where there was so much uncertainty going on. But that was very, very meaningful for me at that time. It was really challenging at times. We went through the whole application process was as if we were applying to be a missionary for global ministries. And so there was kind of layer upon layer of 20-page applications, layer upon layer of different structures you had to go through. There was no places for classes to be held like they are now, where we can go online or gather together as potential deaconesses and home missioners. So I had to go to seminary, I have United Theological Seminary not far from me, which was fine and wonderful. I had good classes there, but nobody understood about being a deaconess there. In fact, most of my classes, the professor would even question me and say, "Oh, you're not being a deacon. You want to be a deacon. There's no such thing as deaconesses anymore. That diaconal ministry, that's all gone." And I said, no, I'm not diaconal ministry. I am a deaconess. And yes, it's in the Book of Discipline. It's paragraph 1313 at that time. And I just had to learn all of that around and just keep explaining to these professors who all thought, and students who thought, "Oh, deaconesses, they're not around anymore. They all died off." That was the big thing I was told. And I said, no, it's been actually reapproved by General Conference. So that is what I am doing. So it was a struggle in that way. And there was not a lot of camaraderie amongst those of us who were candidates. I didn't even know if there were other deaconess candidates at that time. Finally met the other deaconesses, and there were just deaconesses. It wasn't home missioners then. When they finally brought us together for a 2-week training and orientation, 2 weeks. Now we're lucky if we get 2 days, but this was 2 weeks, and it was in Atlanta at the Missionary Training School for Global Ministries, and it was held on, I think, on the campus of Emory. But the point being is that's when I first found out there were other people doing this, other women. And so that's where I met some of those who were then in my class that were commissioned then that fall. So that was sort of, it wasn't as exciting as I was hoping it would have been. And our commissioning was very small, and it was done in a little side room off of the hall where they were having global ministries board meetings. So it wasn't even anything terribly exciting. So that was that's the difference. And if I were to compare it between the way it is now in 2022 with deaconesses and home missioners, we just didn't have the camaraderie and all the joy of knowing each other like I see in so many of the new ones now, where you get to know each other from the moment you have your first class together. And and so it's really a very different kind of start, I think. I grew up in as a child and teenager during the 1960s and early 70s, and so I was really impacted by the civil rights movement at that time. And even though I lived in a very rural area of Ohio, and honestly, I had not even come into contact with any other ethnic groups at all during that time. I could just remember feeling the disparity and the challenges of folk who were struggling for their rights, and it did kind of affect me in that way. So that was always in the back of my mind. When I got to a college program, it was in an early entrance program, and honestly felt that I just didn't know much about the world because I grew up very isolated and not very exposed to other ways of living. Then I did meet a young man who was African American, and he was really instrumental and very transparent in sharing his life and where he lived. Came from Kentucky. His parents were very educated, very interested in seeing him succeed. And so it was really fascinating for me to hear his story and just get his encouragement, that thinking on what civil rights was and how it affected even us as the more white dominant culture, how that was important that I be open and thoughtful to new ideas. So I kind of really give him credit for being so open and transparent with me and helping to me understand the disparities that were going on in the United States during the 60s. So that kind of stayed with me. I later went to college, got married, finished college over a long period of time, and became a public school teacher, elementary public school teacher during the 90s. And so I also was in a sort of an urban suburban context at that time. And I did get to see a lot of ethnic differences and was just so impressed about the way that the children were together and sharing and how we all were learning from each other, which I thought was really, really helpful. It was about during that time in the 90s that we became acquainted with a pastor from a church in South Africa. So he was from Pinetown Methodist Church in South Africa. And we came to know him and his family and his church through one of the advanced special programs of the United Methodist Church. And so we began to help with some fundraising for their school. And they were in a white area of South Africa, where they were bringing in children from the township areas, which were primarily Black South Africans. So it was another good lesson for me to learn from that. We ended up going there 3 times as part of just an exchange and a mission team, I suppose you could say. But it was just, again, a really good time of learning, and actually went there right after apartheid had fallen. So it was just a fantastic, amazing experience for me to really understand more about justice through the lens of white privilege and the idea of working with folks who are in places where they are oppressed. So that kind of was, again, influencing me to realize that I had a call to ministry that was more than just in school teaching. Not that that's not important, because it is, but it was just really a time that I thought there's more I know God has me to do. Several other things happened that allowed me then to, after I finished my master's degree in educational administration, to be involved with some other mission projects around in the United States. And then I was approached I guess it was as I was doing my deaconess studies about serving as the executive director for a program in the United Methodist Church called Nomads. And Nomads was this mission volunteer program that put folks who had recreational vehicles in places of service all over the United States. So I actually administered that program for 4 years and really enjoyed it. And again, got me to so many different places to be able to see the disparities between people, even in the United States. When we'd go down in the Rio Valley in Texas and find out education and voting was just so difficult for people in many times, and just finding out some of the the food deserts in our urban areas, and just all these different justice issues that were kind of coming at me during that time, and learning about those. So from that, then I got another call from, actually it was Becky Louder. She wasn't Becky Louder then, but she was the deaconess who was at the Board of Global Ministries. And she said, if you're interested, there's a position open that I think you would be really good at if you're interested in coming and working for the Board of Global Ministries in New York. And I said, oh, well, okay, well, let me think about that. And so having done the 4 years with the Nomads program, I was kind of feeling like I had taken that as far as I could. And there was just some things going on that I thought maybe this is the time that I look into that. So I just looked into it thinking, oh, they probably won't want me, a small town girl from Ohio in New York. But well, as it turned out, a couple different circumstances, it worked out that I was hired for that position. And it was in mission context and relationships. I was the executive that actually acted as the liaison between global ministries and women's division, which was UMW. And I held the portfolio of doing a lot of the major work around international ministries. So it was interesting because I was global ministry staff, but I also spent 80% of my time with United Methodist Women, and helped oversee and did the legwork about getting grants out to all the different areas where United Methodist Women were present in the world. So I traveled a lot internationally, just kept learning so much. It was so amazing to see what some of these women had to come through in order to get educations and to provide for their families. I think one of the most impactful times was my time in Liberia, and I went there right after Civil War had ended, and there was a large gathering of women, and these were, United Methodist women, and they were just telling their stories, and I hear their stories of what they had come through the Civil War. Many have watching their children and their daughters die, or when rape was used as a method of war, and having them tell those stories, and just crying with them and praying with them, right? It was just that was a very life-changing moment for me even then. And so it was just, I just felt in such a wonderful place to be able to hear the stories and then do what I could to make sure their programs and their projects got funded so they could continue the good work they were doing. So that was a great joy for me to serve with the board. I was there almost 5 years. And then it came to a point in time again where there was lots changing at Global Ministries. There was Harriet Olson had just come on as the new leader for United Methodist Women, and we knew there was going to be some downsizing, and so again, just God kind of nudging me to a different position, and leading me back to Ohio where my family was, and I had grandchildren by that time. So it was just an interesting move to come back and be involved with a local nonprofit organization that really worked for around equity for those who were marginalized. So also while we did food pantries and we had a clothing like a thrift store, we were also making sure they had GED classes and job training classes and doing those things that I felt were, and that we felt were equitable and not just providing a charitable need. So they were empowering people to be able to go to their next dream. And providing, we even started a program where we provided cars for people. So people from the church would donate cars. We had some folks who fixed them up, and then we would give them through a very careful process, but give them to those people who had need of transportation. So just a lot of good things happened during that time that I felt, again, drew out this whole idea of love and justice and service. So I stayed in that position to 2015. At that point in time, my mother, she was hitting 92 years old. She was becoming more in need of care. And so she moved in with me. I cared for her for several years. I started my position working for the Deaconess and Home Missioner Administrative Office then as a consultant, also under Becky at that time. It was Becky and Scott, and then continue to do this work that I'm doing today with them around coaching and administrative work. And, you know, again, just being able to help with things that where I can really hear the stories of people and their struggles and their needs and their calls to ministry too. My greatest joy in being a deaconess is just the idea of knowing that God has put together this amazing plan where whether you're called to be working in the field actively, or whether you're called to administration, or whether you're called to, you know, even be an educator, or what we would consider lay professions, nursing, or any of those things, that is all important. And that no matter who we are or what we do with that, that just being able to acknowledge that call by God and to live that out through your vocation has just been really, really good for me. So even when I was teaching public school, because that's not anything that should ever be taken lightly. You know, I remember going in the few years before I switched to doing the other work, that thinking, you know, it's sort of like God's got my back. I've always felt like there was someone I could call. I remember calls to Becky Lauder's office in different places where I could have someone to talk to about my ministry and what was going on. And so I think that's the connection of our Deaconess and Home Missioner community, I think is probably by far one of my greatest joys. And then having that ministry and that position of deaconess acknowledged by the general church, I think was also important, because I kind of feel like I grew up in a time of the world when the only real people doing ministry were clergy people doing ministry, right? You know, those who were preaching on Sunday and who received salaries through the local church. They're the only legitimate ministries. But being able to be a part of the deaconess community, that I can see that that's not just what it's about. It's about lay people who feel called to love, justice, and service. That's also the backbone of the church. I mean, we're the ones, honestly, who get things done. And I even see that in our own annual conference in West Ohio, where our bishop will quite often say, hey, if we want something done, let's get the deaconesses together and let's get this done. And I just think that's such a big shift than it was, you know, 20 plus years ago when I started as a deaconess, where I was still getting questions like, oh, you're still around? So that's what's really important for me, I think. Being part of the coaching and the administrative work of reading applications and doing interviews. It's just so wonderful to me to see younger women coming in, seeing so many, such a broad diversity of ethnicity and race and gender identity and everything coming in so diverse. And I think I look at all of those, and at assembly, I was looking just over our whole crowd of deaconesses and home missioners was there. It was just this is how God intended it to be, you know, a diverse group of people who are called, who are educated, who are not fearful of the intellectual, but who embrace the intellectual, right? Who love to learn, who love to serve. The challenge is always, again, helping people to recognize what deaconesses do and home missioners, and understanding that lay people have a strong position in the church. I think also one of my challenges has just been the hierarchy of the church and how we're structured, so that we're structured sometimes more like a business than a ministry. And so you get all these layers of how things have to be done. And I think sometimes we forget the humanity of it. And so when it comes to the love part and I'll hear people disparaging LGBTQ people in the church, and there I am saying, no, I'm called to a ministry of love, and Jesus doesn't discriminate whether you're male or female or LGBTQIA plus, or you're Black or you're white or whatever. We are all called equally into ministry. And so that's the discouraging part for me in the church right now, and how we need to be more acknowledging and making a level playing field so that everyone can come and everyone can serve, and no one feels shut out of God's love or shut out of the church. Just always never stop seeking and discerning what your calling is. Don't feel like you're stuck in a place. You don't have to be, because there are so many ways that God can use you in ministry. And don't be afraid to learn and to change your mind about things. My spirituality has grown so much by being a deaconess and hearing just the thoughts of other deaconesses and home missioners in where they're at in their spiritual growth, and finding what they're reading and what's good about what they're reading, and how do we work this so that we can frankly change the church, be those leaders ahead that can point the way to where the church needs to go. And I think that's always been the case with United Methodist Women in our predecessors organizations. We were always the ones pointing the way forward. And I think now deaconesses and home missioners are in that place where they can continue to do that. If they, they just don't lose heart, don't lose hope, and just continue to do that pushing forward. And then again, using the spirituality that God has created in each of us, and the intellect that God has given to each of us, to continue to push on that too, and never become stagnant. Don't get so settled that you're afraid to change, because to change is good. God created the world to change, right? So I think we just have to be aware of that and continue to move forward.